We kick off week 2 of Duskmourn spoilers with a Tamiyo Saga, a new Nashi, some sweet rooms, and so much more. Let's break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Duskmourn spoilers. So today we kick off week 2 of spoiler season. Currently, we have about 75% I think of the rares and mythics from the set, so we had a lot during the first week, but there's still quite a bit more to go, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Duskmourn. First up today, we get our red mythic room in Charred Foyer / Curved Room. So the front half of the card, Charred Foyer, 4 mana at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library, you can play it this turn. The back half of the card, Curved Room, 6 mana, says once each turn, you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for a spell that you cast from exile. So this card seems pretty reasonable. Charred Foyer is essentially like an outpost siege. There's a few different red enchantments that are 4 mana and impulse draw you a card each turn. They tend to be fine. They haven't seen a ton of competitive play recently, but the back half of this card, Curved Room, there's no perfect comparison. The best though that I could come up with is it's essentially a one with the multiverse, but only for cards from exile, but you get 1 free spell each turn. And the card does synergize nicely with itself, right? So if you get it fully unlocked and you have both rooms open, Charred Foyer will impulse draw you a card, and then you can cast that card for free with Curved Room. Obviously, if you have other ways to get things in exile that you can cast, it gets even better because it'll power up Curved Room even more. So I think this card, it's good in Prosper. I couldn't resist. I know. It's so cliche at this point, but it is actually like super good in Prosper, or maybe good in Feldorn or Rocco. Anything that cares about playing from exile. The card's kind of ridiculous, right? Not only is this another way to get things in exile, to trigger your Prosper, your Feldorn, or your Rocco, but once each turn, you get to cast one of those cards for free. And if you're playing Prosper, or Feldorn, or Rocco, kind of the whole gimmick of your deck is you're going to have a bunch of these effects that are exiling cards and letting you cast them from exile, which makes Curved Room really absurd because notice it says once each turn, not once during each of your turns. So if you can get a bunch of cards in exile, stuff like Ren's Resolve, that's like you can play this until the end of your next turn. You can cast a card for free during your turn, cast another one for free during your opponent's turn. You could really be getting 4 free spells each turn off of Curved Room, assuming you can exile enough cards. So I know every set there's a card that's good in Prosper. There's so many good in Prosper cards that they literally can't all be good in Prosper because there's just not enough room in a Prosper deck to play all the good in Prosper cards. But I think this one actually makes the cut, not because of Charred Foyer, which is fine, but we have many other cards that are like that. There's plenty of replacements for Charred Foyer. What makes this unique is really the Curved Room half. So where can we play this card outside of these exile-based commander decks? In Standard, my first thought was, these could be really good in Big Red. I don't know if you remember, one of the first decks we played after Bloomburrow released was this budget Big Red deck with Sunspine Links and Charming Scoundrel, and I feel like Charred Foyer could be really good there just as a way to generate card advantage. We're really good at ramping up to 4 mana, so we get this down a turn early, start drawing extra cards, find more of our big finishers, and then maybe eventually, if we got nothing else to do, we unlock Curved Room and somehow get some value out of it, probably with Curved Foyer. So I think that's one possibility. Another place that we've seen cards like this be good in the past is in red aggressive decks. Not in the main deck, because it's too slow for the main deck, but cards like this can be good sideboard cards where you're playing mono red, you run into the control matchup where you know you're going to be dealing with temporary lockdowns and sunfalls and tons of cheap removal, and you bring this card in as like your sideboard card to deal with control decks. Is this better than just playing Ouroboros Forge, which kind of fills that role? Can you play both of them somehow? I don't actually know, but that is another way that you can take advantage of this card. Another option is just play it in a ramp deck where you're just like going to be getting up so much mana you can easily unlock Curved Room, and this is just generating card advantage each turn. Plus, there are some additional ways to get things that are castable into exile in Standard. Loot, for example, exiles a bunch of cards and you can cast those cards. So if you can actually get Curved Room going with loot, you're probably going to have like a really good turn. Visions of Phyrexia exiles on your end step, gives you a card you can cast until the next turn, so you can technically get the free spell during your opponent's turn. Like, you can cast the Charred Foyer card for free during your turn, and then using Curved Room, once it's unlocked, you can cast the Visions card for free during your opponent's turn. Bonehorde Rakosaur, another way you can get cards in exile that you can cast. So there are some ways to build around this. Is it going to be worth it? We'll have to wait and see. One of the quirks of this standard is because the class enchantments from Bloomburrow are so strong. Innkeeper's Talent, Caretaker's Talent, two of the best cards in the entire format. The meta is pretty prepared for enchantment, so I'm not sure how realistic it's going to be to like play Charred Foyer and then pay 6 more mana to turn on Curved Room and have this sit out on the battlefield for a while. I imagine what's probably going to happen a lot of the time is you like play Charred Foyer, and when you go to spend 6 mana for Curved Room, your opponent just blows it up and you're really sad. But I do think this is a powerful effect, so I think it's a build around for standard that can be incredibly powerful. I mean, casting spells for free is one of the most broken things you can do in all of Magic, and Curved Room can do that. Worst case, I think this card is legitimately good in Prosper and any of those other Cast from Exile commander decks. We also got a wild blue mythic in Abhorrent Oculus. So Abhorrent Oculus, 3 mana, 5/5 flying. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, manifest red, so you get a 2/2 with one of the top 2 cards of your deck. Maybe you can flip it up later, but is an additional cost to cast this spell. Exile 6 cards from your graveyard. So when you first read this card, it reads like an absolutely busted card. Like, a 3 mana 5/5 flyer is absurd, and then you're manifest dreading each turn, but exiling a bunch of your cards from the graveyard, that's a bit of a concern. So is this card actually good? So at first glance, you might be thinking, oh, what about Delve? Delve has you exile cards from your graveyard, and that mechanic is incredibly busted. Like, ban cards everywhere, broken back in Modern and in Pioneer. The thing is, Abhorrent Oculus isn't exactly Delve. Delve is an upside. You can exile cards to reduce the cost of something like Tasigur. Abhorrent Oculus, you have to exile 6 cards from your graveyard, or you can't even cast it. So it's a bit riskier, right? If you can't fill your graveyard, this gets stuck in your hand. But the card has an insane amount of upside. First, 3 mana 5/5 flyer is off the charts. Like, those are stats that typically come with a ridiculous drawback, like Master of Feast, drawing your opponent a card each turn, or Dormant Goromoza, not ever untapping and really doing nothing. Like, typically there is some huge drawback for these stats, and Abhorrent Oculus doesn't have that huge of a drawback, right? You gotta be able to exile 6 cards from your graveyard, but assuming you can do that once it's on the battlefield, it is all upside. And in Standard, there's lots of ways to fill your graveyard. We see Founding the Third Path, Felicia Archaeologist, Picklock Pranksters. Sadly, none of these cards actually gets enough cards in the graveyard on turn 2 to cast Inoculus on turn 3, but if you had like a Cetophobe or Gnawing Vermin on turn 1, you can definitely mill enough cards to be casting this on turn 3, and then on turn 3 of a 5/5 flyer, you pass the turn, you get your first 2/2. That is a ridiculous start. It is very, very strong, and then every turn that sits on the battlefield, it's kind of doing the Tender Shoot Dryad thing. It doesn't work on your upkeep, only your opponent's upkeep, so not quite as good, especially in a 1v1 format, but still, being able to make these 2/2s repeatedly is very, very strong. So when you think about all these things put together, like above the curve stats, generating tokens, or I guess not exactly tokens, but face down cards that kind of work like tokens, and then once you get back to older formats, it's even easier to turn this on, because a single Tome Scour, or think about Dredge, they fill their graveyard so quickly. Getting 6 cards in your graveyard is very, very easy to do in a format like Modern or Pioneer. So when you add all this together, Abhorrent Oculus seems busted, right? However, I lived through Scabruinator. I don't know how many of you were playing during original Innistrad, but during original Innistrad, they spoiled Scabruinator, and this card was like 40, 50 bucks. It was incredibly hyped. It's a 3 mana 5/6 flyer. It's an additional cost to cast it. You gotta exile 3 cards from your graveyard, 3 creature cards from your graveyard, and you can cast it from your graveyard. When this was first revealed, people thought this card was going to be busted. And it turned out that Scabruinator was actually stone unplayable. getting 3 creatures in your graveyard was just a deal breaker for this card. It never really made it in literally any format, and then went down as one of the worst mythics of all time after being really, really hyped during spoiler season. And I'm a little worried that we might be heading the same direction with Abhorrent Oculus. Yes, when everything goes to plan and you fill your graveyard and you get this down, it's gonna be absurd. But there's gonna be games when things don't go to plan. Like if your opponent plays a Rest in Peace or a Leyline of the Void, suddenly you cannot cast this card, period, end of story, for the rest of the game until you deal with one of the enchantments. Even just like a Tranquil throwback to wipe your graveyard can really, really slow this down. So this is a card that is super high risk and high reward. Like when you get this on the battlefield, there's a decent chance it's going to win you the game, especially if you're doing it on turn 3. But there's also going to be times when the fact that you just can't fill your graveyard or your opponent hates on your graveyard is going to make it lose the game, where you're just stuck with your big payoff in your hand and can never get any value out of it. So I'm a little bit worried this might be Scab Ruinator 2.0. I do want to try it in the Urborg Lurgoyf deck. We played the Goyf and Beans deck, and it actually worked really well. The deck fills the graveyard really quickly. A little bit awkward. There is some tension here too. Like, if we're filling our graveyard, we want creatures in our graveyard to power our Urborg Lurgoyfs and our Cruel Somnophages, so we don't really want to exile those to the Oculus, so hopefully we can like exile enough lands and leave our creatures. But there is a tension in a graveyard deck between exiling all these cards and wanting to have things left in your graveyard, but I would at least try it there. I will say in Commander, the card gets even better because it triggers on each opponent's upkeep to manifest Dread. So if you're playing some sort of self-mill commander deck, I think this is worth considering, mostly for the manifest Dread. Like, you play this in Commander, makes it 1 time around the table, you're gonna manifest Dread 3 times. So for 3 mana, you get a 5/5 in 3 face-down 2/2s, and if it lives another turn cycle, it's gonna do it again. So if you're playing like Sidisi or Mirko or Tasigur, or some sort of aggressive self-mill deck, I think the card is really, really strong there. So I'm going to say Abhorrent Oculus. I hope I'm wrong. I hope this is not Scab Ruinator 2.0, but I can just not shake the fear that it is, because I just remember being so hyped for Scab Ruinator and thinking that card was so incredibly busted and it was going to be so good, and a lot of people did because it was so expensive. So I just remember that experience so vividly, and I can't shake the feeling that the same thing might happen again with Abhorrent Oculus. I think it's really powerful. Maybe it'll be way better than I think. I will say exiling any 6 cards is easier than exiling 3 creatures, and this is a more powerful creature on the battlefield thanks to manifest dreading, so the reward is higher. So I think it is better than Scab Ruinator, but I am a little concerned that once we start playing with the card, we find out it's just a little too clunky or too easy to hate on for it to actually be good, even though this reads like one of the most absurdly busted cards from the entire set so far. But let me know what you think. Is this card incredibly busted, or is this Scab Ruinator 2.0? Let me know what you think in the comments. Next up, we have a saga that is telling the tale of Tamiyo, quite literally, the tale of Tamiyo. So it is a 3 mana legendary saga. I believe this is the first ever legendary saga that has been printed. Its first 3 modes: mill 2 cards. If 2 cards that share a card type are milled this way, draw a card and repeat the process. And then the 4th lore counter is exile any number of target instants and sorceries and or Tamiyo Planeswalker cards from your graveyard. Copy them. You may cast any number of those copies. Worth pointing out here, just so it's super duper clear, you do have to spend mana on those cards. So it's not, I don't know, letting you cast all of them for free, which would be incredibly busted if this was like Mizzix's Mastery that makes you wait a few turns. But you do have to spend mana on all those cards, so keep that in mind. So with Tale of Tamiyo, you essentially get a bunch of Seed of Hopes, except the big issue I have with the first lore counters on this card is I don't think it's super likely that you're going to mill 2 cards of the same type and draw a card. I was actually like doing a little hypergeometric calculating to get an idea of what this looked like. And let's say you're playing a 60 card deck and you have 30 cards that are the same type. You're only like 25% to mill those 2 cards to the same type. The good news is it's actually a little better than that, because you're going to have the other half of your deck mostly be lands. And some people have went pretty in depth on the math and figured out it's right around like 50% of the time you'll draw a card off of this if you're playing a deck that's heavily skewed towards one card type. Like, let's say you have a deck that's 30 creatures, the Tale of Tamiyo itself, maybe a place-set of a removal spell in lands. You're about 50% to draw a card with any of those first 3 lore counters, which I don't know, like, if you think about it, you get 3 of them, right? So you probably draw a card maybe once out of the 3 lore counters. Maybe if you get lucky, you get 2 cards out of it. Obviously, there's going to be some times where you get super lucky and you like mill 2 creatures, draw a card, mill 2 more creatures, draw a card, and it's just like absurd. But I think in general, the card advantage mode of this is not going to be super strong. The last mode of this is actually very strong. It's essentially a Past in Flames almost, where you just can cast all the instants and sorceries in your graveyard. I don't think this is going to replace actual Past in Flames in like Modern or anything, because it's just so slow, right? You have to play this and wait 3 turns to finally get to the 4th lore counter and then Past in Flames. When if you're playing Modern Storm, you just want to play Past in Flames and win the game on the spot. But it is a powerful effect. I think the reason this card is legendary is specifically to make it work with Nashi. I was wondering, why would they print a legendary saga? Like, every saga is telling a story. Why is this one about Tamiyo in specific, the legendary story? And I'm pretty sure it's just to make it work with Nashi, because that's kind of the whole flavor of this, is Nashi is Tamiyo's adopted son and trying to figure out, like, something to do with Tamiyo. I don't know, I should read more of the lore. But there's some connection there, and Nashi Moon's Legacy specifically lets you cast legends or rats from your graveyard. So I think this is so you can cast the Tale of Tamiyo from the graveyard with Nashi, and then get the value going that way. As far as actually playing this card, I see maybe a chance it could work in like the Founding the Third Path decks. You've probably seen the standard decks. It's like Founding the Third Path to cast a Squirming Emergence to get back a Founding the Third Path and then eventually reanimate some huge thing and use it to win the game. The Tale of Tamiyo kind of can do the same thing. Like, it fills your graveyard. It maybe draws you a card if you get lucky. And then that last lore counter is going to let you cast your Squirming Emergence or whatever. So I don't think it's as good as Founding the Third Path, which is kind of funny since the Tale of Tamiyo is the rare and like the Tamiyo card, and Founding the Third Path just kind of a throwaway uncommon. But I could see it working in a similar place. Another place this could be interesting is like a payoff for some sort of otter deck. I'm trying to figure out, how do you use that 4th lore counter? And the best I can see for standard is some sort of like, you're playing a prowess style deck and you play a Tale of Tamiyo. It's a non-creature spell, so it triggers prowess on your stuff. You start milling and filling your graveyard, and then you get to that last lore counter and you just have this big storm style turn where you're able to like cast a ton of spells, get a ton of value, pump your team a bunch, win the game. The big issue I have with that plan is your opponents are going to see it coming, right? Once you get to like the 2nd lore counter and the 3rd lore counter, your opponent's going to be like, I better get these prowess creatures off the battlefield, or I'm just going to straight up die next turn. So it is very telegraphed, I guess. Your opponent can see their demise coming at them and will probably try to solve that. So I don't know if that's actually like super realistic, but I could see it being a possibility. Could also be an interesting way to power up Ral Crackling Wit, where you like get that last lore counter, cast a bunch of spells, ultimate Ral, then you kind of have like Storm with everything, which is wild. I thought about, could I play this in like the Urborg Lurgoyf deck that we played before? Because we did just play this budget up a beanstalk, Urborg Lurgoyf, like chain together all this graveyard stuff. The deck's almost all creatures. It wants to fill the graveyard. And I think the answer is no. Like, this asks for something very specific, right? Sure, a Tale of Tamiyo could fill the graveyard to power up our Urborg Lurgoyfs or Cruel Somnophages, but in that deck, we're pretty much all creatures, so the last mode's not going to do anything. You need a deck that wants to fill the graveyard, has a lot of the same card type, and has a bunch of instants and sorceries, which is just a pretty big ask. Like, if your deck can actually hit all those marks, then a Tale of Tamiyo could be pretty good. Is there a deck that actually hits all those marks? That's another question. I think if you're just playing this for mill, it's not really good enough. We had Cemetery Tampering in Standard. No one played it. That's just mill 3 on each of your upkeeps, and then eventually you get to cast the Hideaway card. If this is just mill 2, mill 2, mill 2, I don't think you can really make it worth it. So you need to be able to really take advantage of the mill and also the last lore counter to cast a bunch of stuff from your graveyard. There is some weird jank combo potential. So if you can play like an all MDFC mana base, Recross the Pass lets you stack literally your entire deck. Recross Pass says reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a land card. Put that card into play. The rest go on the bottom of your library in any order. That's the key word there. It's not a random order. It's any order, which means you actually get to stack your deck, and then you clash and return to your hand, whatever. That doesn't really matter. The key part here is, let's say you're playing all MDFCs, you cast Recross the Pass, you get to stack your entire deck, so you can guarantee that the first or second or third lore counter on a Tale of Tamiyo is going to be double double hitting, draw you cards, mill your entire deck, draw your entire deck. You'd have to have a way to win with it. I guess like Tale of Tamiyo Recross Pass, and then like Thassa's Oracle is your last card, could win you the game. It can also do like a weird treasure hunt thing. We've played like zombie hunt decks where your entire deck is just lands, treasure hunt, and like zombie infestation to discard all the lands you draw, and you're trusting that treasure hunt's just gonna like draw your deck and you make a bunch of zombies and win. If your deck's playing like 55 lands or something, 4 Tale of Tamiyos, 1 zombie hunt, you are going to double hit a lot in that scenario. You're also going to mill a lot for no apparent reason. Maybe there's a way you can like add some land reanimation to the mix. I don't know, but there is some janky synergies for this card. As far as Commander is concerned, I think you really need to be a Tamiyo deck. If you're playing like Tamiyo Tribal with Tamiyo Inquisitive Suda as your commander and all the Tamiyo Planeswalkers, then this card kind of an auto-include. The flavor is super perfect. And then some of the Tamiyos care about graveyard stuff. You can use like Tamiyo Collector of Tales to get stuff back from your graveyard that you mill with the Tale of Tamiyo. Otherwise, I don't know. I think the card's really cool, but I feel like the first 3 lore counters are mostly just going to be mill 2 cards. The odds of drawing a card off it in most decks is just low enough that it's often just going to be mill 2, mill 2, mill 2, and I don't think that's enough value. And then the last mode is nice, I guess, even if you just flashback a couple removal spells, that's nice, but you really want it to be win the game mode to make up for the first 3 lore counters not really doing that much. So all around, I would say, I think a Tale of Tamiyo, very flavorful. It has potential to be very powerful, but it's also going to be very challenging to build a deck that can really harness its power, to have enough of the same card type to draw some cards with the first 3 lore counters, but also enough instants or sorceries or Tamiyos to get value out of the last lore counter. So it's going to be an interesting deck building challenge. If someone can build the right deck, the card could be really good. Otherwise, in most decks, I think it's probably not going to make the cut. Speaking of Tamiyos and Nashis, we have Tamiyo's adopted son, Nashi, Searcher in the Dark. So Nashi, 2 mana 2/2 Dimir Rat Ninja Wizard. It is menace, and it says when it deals combat damage to a player, mill that many cards. You may put any number of legendary and or enchantment cards from among them into your hand. If you didn't put any cards in your hand this way, put a +1/+1 counter on Nashi. So Nashi, this card's pretty interesting to me. So obviously, for it to be good, you need a deck with a lot of enchantments and or legends in it. Thankfully, we're entering a world where we're getting a lot of enchantments in Duskmourn, and there's always a lot of legends. That's been one of the big hallmarks of the last couple of years of Magic sets, is every set seemingly has like a legendary sub-theme thanks to Commander. So it's going to be easier to make it work than it probably looks, just because there's so many legends and enchantments these days. My question for this card, let's start with the bad news, which is, can this beat out the other options that exist in Standard? And this is one of the downsides, I think, to having 3-year Standard, is there's a lot of cards competing for each slot. So if you're going to put Nashi in your deck, it needs to beat out like Fairy Mastermind and Malcolm and Deep Cavern Bat or Misery Shadow or Vadmir or Lazav. There's a lot of different cards kind of in this space that you might want to play over Nashi. So to choose Nashi over these other options, or to play it alongside 1 or 2 of these other options, you're definitely going to need a deck with a lot of legends and or a lot of enchantments. So where could we play this card? So my first thought was some sort of Rona Relic of Legends decks. We have had straight up legendary themed decks in Standard. They've kind of fallen off a little bit with Slogurk rotating, but before rotation, we had straight up Relic of Legends, Rona style decks. Nashi seems really good there. You just play it as a 2-drop. Worst case, it's a legend, so you can tap it to Relic of Legends. It's going to trigger your Rona when you cast it. Best case, you get an attack or 2 with it, and it's drawing you a couple of cards, which seems very, very powerful. And there are a lot of legends in the format. We were talking about this before. Like, if you wanted to build Dimir Tempo or Dimir Midrange and have pretty much every one of your creatures be a legend, that is very achievable in our current Standard format with Malcolms and Vadmir and Lazavs and Nashis. So there are ways to make this work. Can you just jam this into the best or like most top tier version of Dimir Midrange and have it be good? Probably not. But could you build a version of Dimir Midrange or Dimir Tempo where Nashi was very good? Definitely possible. Also very good with Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Remember, this can find any legend, not just legendary creatures. So this is a card that fills the graveyard for Soul Cauldron, and also, if it gets in hits, digs to find the Soul Cauldron, so maybe it could have some uses there. We obviously still have, like, Joda the Unifier in Standard. If you want to just go full-on Legends, works really well in, like, a Joda-style deck, and it works with a Tale of Tamiyo, Founding the Third Path, these melee Saga-y enchantments that want to get in your graveyard, plus you can use Nashi to try to find them because they're enchantments, so maybe there's some sort of weird Dimir enchantment deck. So I think all around, as far as Standard is concerned, this is a card that could be good enough to see play. Like I said before, you can't just jam it in every deck, because not every deck's going to have enough legends or enchantments to make this work. You really want to be drawing cards with Nashi, I think, at some point in the game for it to be worth putting in your deck. Menace is actually huge here. If this didn't have Menace, I think it would be stone unplayable, but Menace means you should be able to at least get in that first hit if you play it on turn 2, and then you can start snowballing it and growing its power to maybe draw more cards in the future, or just start drawing cards. So I think in the right deck it could be Standard playable, but I'm not sure this card was made specifically for Standard. I think this card might actually have more implications in Commander. So why am I hyped for this card in Commander? And the answer is, it supports two different themes that haven't really had a good Commander in its color. So first, this might be the best Dimir Legends Commander. Rona also is pretty fine and does care about Legends, but I think I would rather just play Nashi. So if you want to build a Legendary theme deck that's only Dimir, Nashi is at least the second best option, and maybe the first best option is your Commander. Even more importantly, this is like the first ever Dimir enchantment Commander. Dimir just normally doesn't care about enchantments. We literally have no good commanders for this. So if you want to build an enchantment theme deck, this is kind of the default commander in Dimir now, and there are some really good enchantments in Dimir: Grave Pacts, Heuristic Studies, Phyrexian Arenas, Propagandas, so you have plenty of good enchantments to make it work. So I'm kind of hyped about that. I really love commanders that bring archetypes into colors that didn't previously have support in that color combination. So just being a Dimir enchantment commander, pretty exciting. Plus, I think it's probably worth playing in the 99 of, like, Joda or Sisay or another legendary theme deck is an on-theme card that generates some card advantage. So all in all, I would say Nashi seems like a solid 2-drop, but only for specific decks. You gotta have a lot of enchantments, you gotta have a lot of legends. In that deck though, it could be a staple 2-drop in Standard, plus it's really sweet to have Enchantress support in Dimir and Commander. Next up, we got a rare Azorius Room enchantment in Private Office / Lecture Hall. So first half, Private Office, 4 mana in white, says whenever you unlock this room, destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater. The second half, Lecture Hall, 7 mana blue enchantment, says other permanents you control have hexproof. So this card, I think, is pretty interesting. If you think about what it is, Private Office is essentially a Dusk Dawn style sweeper where it's only blowing up big creatures, but that can be an upside. If you're playing a deck with a lot of small creatures, you can kind of turn it into a Plague Wind. And then the back half is privilege position, essentially a expensive privilege position, but it kind of makes up for that by being a Wrath early, and then you can turn on Lecture Hall later. Privilege position, such an interesting card. I used to think this was like a commander staple where, like, 10 years ago I would just jam this in so many decks, but I found that I don't play it nearly as much as I used to. So where does this card fit? So in Standard, the obvious home is going to be aggro weenie decks for the Wrath mode for Private Office, where if you're playing like a Convoke style deck where almost all your creatures are going to be 1 or 2 power, you can Private Office, hopefully blow up most or all of your opponent's creatures and keep all your creatures, so then you can just Alpha Strike and win the game pretty much the same way you would play a Dusk Dawn. The back half of the card, giving all your stuff hexproof, is powerful. There's no doubt about it, but I don't think it's actually going to be that relevant in Standard, because Standard is already super prepared for enchantments. Because of Caretaker's talent and Innkeeper's talent, pretty much every deck is already built to be able to interact with an enchantment, because if you don't, you just lose to those class enchantments from Bloomburrow. So I think the possibility of paying 7 mana to get a privilege position seems like most of the time you're just going to get blown out. You're going to spend 7 mana and your opponent's just going to get lost it, or Tranquil Frillback it, or Destroy Evil it, or Tear Asunder it, because remember, it does not give itself hexproof. It only gives your other things hexproof. So even after you spend 7 mana on this, your opponent can still just blow it up. Although it is cute if you can somehow get 2 Lecture Halls on the battlefield, then you kind of get the hexproof lock where they protect each other and your stuff's never going to die to targeted removal for pretty much for the rest of the game. But 7 mana is just a big ask in a format that's already prepared for enchantments. I also want to mention, and you might already know this, but rooms are kind of weird. And one of the things I saw people talking about was, oh man, this is going to be so brutal in Brago commander decks. If you don't know Brago, an infamous blink commander, it can just blink any of your permanents every turn when it gets in combat damage. And people were like, oh man, it's like a wrath every turn. I hit with Brago, I blink the private office, it comes back in, blows up the board, Brago lives because it's only 2 power. But it doesn't exactly work that way. If you blink a room enchantment, it's going to come back into play with 0 rooms open. So if you did want to Wrath every turn with Brago, you're going to have to spend 4 mana every time to open Private Office again after you blink it back into play, which maybe is still super annoying. If you blink it and spend 4 mana and blow up the board and just do that again and again, it still might be good enough in Brago, but it's not quite as good as some people were thinking. So where does this card actually fit in Commander? Most obvious home, decks build around small power creatures. Like Arcades the Strategist usually has a bunch of 0 power defenders. Rigo specifically wants 1 power creatures. If you're playing a Weenie style deck, the card's kind of great, as it's going to mostly be a Plague Wind, kill most of your opponent's stuff, leave your stuff untouched, and then maybe eventually you have enough mana that you turn on Lecture Hall and get some protection. The other place it's intriguing is in enchantment decks, because this is kind of a wrath that is also an enchantment. So if you have synergies for enchantments, like Hannah Ship's Navigator can get them back from the graveyard, or Zur can turn them into creatures, or Alayla might be one of the best enchantment homes. When you cast this, you get to make a fairy because it's an enchantment, and then it also is going to blow up your opponent's stuff, but your board has all these little fairy tokens, so it seems really good there. So I think those are the main homes, either decks built around small creatures, or enchantment style decks that want a wrath that works with the theme of their deck. So Private Office / Lecture Hall, I think the card's good. The 4 mana Wrath mode is good. Skeptical of Lecture Hall actually being a thing that happens too often in formats like Standard, but seems nice in Commander when you have a lot of mana to turn it on. So if you're playing a Weenie style deck, definitely worth keeping it in mind. As far as lower rarity cards, only a couple new ones from today. I think there were some more that came out over the weekend, but they're all kind of mixed together on the spoiler page, so you can find them over at MTGPreviews.com. I will say, Arabelia Abandoned Owl, kind of an interesting card for aggro. 2 mana 1/3, it's in Boros, it's a legendary artifact toy, and it says when it attacks, it deals X damage to each opponent, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less. So by itself, it kind of attacks for 2 because it's going to hit for 1, your opponent takes 1, you gain a life, and it can get in for a damage. More importantly, we've seen, like, the Convoke decks go really wide with small creatures super fast, thanks to, like, Gleeful Demolition, Resolute Reinforcements. It's pretty easy to flood the board with, like, 5/1/1s, 6/1/1s, 10/1/1s, and in a case like that, a single Arabelia attack probably just wins you the game. So I'm going to be curious to see if Arabelia can show up in the Convoke shells or some sort of Boros aggro shell, because it actually seems like a pretty strong uncommon. Fear of Abduction, super creepy, but just a little too expensive to really see competitive play. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Duskmourn spoilers for today. So how are you feeling about the set heading into week 2 of spoiler season? Let me know in the comments. Oh yeah, by the way, the first of the 4 Commander precons is also up, and Tomer did a video for that over on the Commander YouTube, so make sure to check that out if you haven't seen it already. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Duskmourn spoilers for today. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Duskmourn spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, check out yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe the Against the Odds, where we taught some arena zoomers about owls and creature locks.